Hello, and welcome to the Library of Ideas of the Global Forum on Democratizing Work. My name is Lisa Herzog, and I'll speak about the idea of equal voice at work. Democratizing work, which is one of the claims of the Democratizing Work Manifesto, means that workers are given voice at work. And when it comes to processes such as voting or participating in discussions, that should be an equal voice, independent of someone's gender or race. And for many contexts, it also means independent of one's position in an organization. Now, why is that important? Miranda Fricker, a philosopher, has coined a notion that is useful for thinking about that topic, namely the notion of epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice means that someone is being treated unjustly in their capacity as a knower. So, for example, you want to share your knowledge about something and you're simply not taken seriously because of who you are. That can take place along various dimensions. There is the dimension of gender, when women are taken less seriously than men. There's also the dimension of race, when, for example, non-white people are given much less airtime or much less attention than white people. And what I would add to Fricker's discussion is that it can also happen along the dimension of one's job position in non-democratic organizations, so most of the work organizations that we see today. Because many workers do not have the possibility of speaking about what they really know and being taken seriously just because they are on the lower levels of organizational hierarchies. But voice is very important as a precondition for collective action, in the sense that you need to hear from others about what they think and what they feel about a certain situation, such that you can then start a process of reflecting on what could change and what kind of action could you take to bring this about. So this possibility of raising one's voice is very important for bringing changes to the world of work. And as we all know, there are many areas where we need those changes. Now, how does one explore this topic of voice at work? I'm a philosopher, and so at least most of my time is spent in the armchair. So I work on a theoretical level. And on that level, there are a number of questions about voice that are worth exploring. One is, how exactly is voice at work related to human dignity? And what happens in those cases where workers are denied voice? Another question is how voice at work hangs together with voice in other spheres. So what about one's voice in the family, in political discussions, in civil society? How are the connections to be understood between these different social spheres? And then there's also the question of whose voices are least heard in the way in which society organizes work today. And just to mention one issue here, when we think about voice at work, we might think about unions and co-determination and so on, as they do take place in certain European countries. But what about the workers that work for these companies, but in subsidiaries in other countries, for example, in the global south? They often do not at all have a voice, even if the main company has co-determination. In addition to these theoretical questions, and I would say in close interaction with them, there are also empirical explorations, and lots of people work on this, and I try to interact with them and to look for the synergies here. So, for example, how do individuals actually experience voice or the absence of voice at work? There's a lot of issues about psychology and social psychology here. What does it do to people if they cannot speak out, if they always have to wear a mask at work, as it were. Or the question of what actually enables individuals to raise their voice. And now, just again, a bit from a theoretical perspective, it's quite interesting to think about the relation between the different parts of the manifesto here, because what often prevents people from raising their voice is the fear of losing their job. But if you had a job guarantee, as is also one of the claims of the manifesto in the decommodifying work part, then you would know as a worker that even if you lose your job, there is this possibility of getting a public job because of the job guarantee. And that creates a different psychological constellation when it comes to people's ability and willingness to actually raise their voice. But that's, of course, also something that can be explored empirically. And then lastly, one very interesting empirical question is whether one can verify a theoretical prediction that philosophers thinking about workplace democracy have made for a long time, especially Carol Pateman, one of the pioneers thinking about workplace democracy. That's called the spillover thesis. And the idea here is that if people learn to democratically participate in their workplace, then they will also participate more in political democracy or in civil society organizations. So there would be a spillover of this capacity and willingness to participate from the workplace to other spheres of society. And that is also a very important and interesting field of empirical exploration at the moment. So why does voice matter for the future of work? There are two sets of arguments here. One intrinsic and the other instrumental. Intrinsic arguments mean that it's really about the very nature of voice at work, these processes, no matter what the consequences are in a way. And here there are at least two arguments. One is about individual dignity. There's something deeply insulting about not being able to speak freely in a sphere of life that is so important and so time-consuming for many of us as our work. If you always have to self-censor, that does something. And that's not only a psychological issue, although that's also true, but there's something about human dignity here that's going on. And the second thing is connected to this issue of epistemic injustice, namely that injustice of not listening to those who often know best. And those who often know best are the people doing the actual work, whereas managers and board level decision makers, they are often at quite a distance from the people who do the actual work. And their decision making could actually be quite negatively influenced by the fact that they know too little about what the people on the ground actually do and actually think, and what ideas for improvements they might have. And that leads me to the second set of arguments, the instrumental ones, because the nice thing about voice at work is that even though I would also argue for it on purely intrinsic merits, we can also expect it to have positive effects. So in that sense, it can be understood as an instrument for better outcomes. One of the reasons is that giving employees voice means that we can take into account a plurality of perspectives. And very often, if we have a broad plurality of perspectives, we can make better decisions because we anticipate potential problems or we come to more creative solutions and so on. Also, by giving people a voice, we can harness the knowledge of the many, as this is called in theories of democracy. And you might want to check out the work by Elaine Landemore, one of our team members, who has done a lot to explore the mechanisms through which democratic processes, deliberation, voting, and so on, can lead to better epistemic outcomes, because all these different bits and pieces and types of knowledge can be taken into account, and that's likely to lead to better outcomes than if you have just a handful of decision makers, as is the case in many companies. So giving workers voice can also help us to create learning organizations that can tackle the many societal challenges that we have in front of us: social inequality, global justice, and the fight against climate change. All of these issues will require bringing lots of ideas, lots of perspectives together. And this is likely to go much better if workers, those who do the actual work day by day on the ground, have the possibility of participating in these discussions. So that's the idea of giving workers equal voice. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope we can meet at the Global Forum. If you want to get in touch, here's my email. Thanks again for being with us.